Before we begin our next lecture, we'd like to look again at where we're at as far as the history of graphic design is concerned. This is a rundown that should be familiar to you at this point in time. Here you see how the last four movements we discussed were very different from each other given why they came about and how they viewed art making and creativity. These are the more important battles raised by the discussion on Russian constructivism and Italian futurism. First is the question of doing art for art's sake versus art for the people. Two other issues are interconnected. These are fine arts such as painting and sculpture versus posters or graphic design, and fine arts versus advertising. The last is the question of how graphic design can and is used as propaganda, as we've seen with Russian constructivism. All these are part of this discussion on the next movement, which is Art Deco. Considered as a direct successor of Art Nouveau, Art Deco was the major art movement in the early to first half of the 1900s. It was happening in France at around the same time as constructivism was happening in Russia and futurism was happening in Italy. As with many movements, Art Deco can be seen as a response to the spirit of that specific period. It appeared in France after World War I, which was a time of returning to order. In that sense, Art Deco fit this period that sought to reconcile national traditions with stylistic novelty. It also worked with the uniqueness of Art Deco, which is born of how it ably brings together both traditional craft motifs and machine-age imagery and materials. What is the aesthetic of Art Deco? It uses geometric shapes as inspired by Egyptian, Aztec, and Assyrian motifs such as zigzags to express the modern era of the machine. It also uses simple, clean shapes as it often works towards a streamlined look and employs geometric ornamentation and stylized representational forms. An important artist of the period is A.M. Cassandra, who built a body of work in Art Deco posters that represents the aesthetic of the movement. This poster has the simple lines, stylized human form, and clean, streamlined look mentioned earlier, with clear inspirations from Cubism and Surrealism. Note that it's the kind of advertising that doesn't even show the product it is selling, and in the end presents the product as exciting and dynamic. This set of posters for different trains by Cassandra also work with the same Art Deco elements of geometric ornamentation, stylized forms, zigzags, and simple lines. Note how the lines signify movement and speed. Cassandra was an immigrant from Ukraine whose family was forced to move to Paris because of the political climate in his home country. He became fascinated by machines, which might be the perspective he took in his art. In these posters for steamship lines, we see the geometric and stylized representation of the boats that also highlights its magnitude and power. He also employed the same Art Deco elements for other subjects, such as this poster for a restaurant bar on a train. Note the stylized representation of the train and the elements he chose to represent the bar, and how these still stick to the clean lines in geometric shapes as well as the dynamism of Art Deco. Cassandra also made typefaces such as this one, but what might be most important to discuss is the next classic ad of his for the alcoholic drink Dubonnet. This ad remains an important point of study to this day because of how Cassandra worked with three panels that showed the evolution of a squared-off little man having a drink, where even the typography and colors shifted seamlessly to represent a change in the man as he drank the product. Here, the Art Deco aesthetic of simple, clean lines and stylized representational imagery work with the concept itself of the ad. Alongside Cassandra, another interesting artist to study for Art Deco is German Ludwig Holbein, who created a series of posters for the Nazi government. Pre-Nazi government, Holbein's work in Plakatstil or poster style already worked with elements of Art Deco. He incorporated depth through pattern, texture, and color. In 1936, Holbein began a series of posters for the Nazi government. This meant propaganda about military might and power. Here, you see how the strong lines and stylistic representation of images work towards highlighting strength and movement. Interestingly, these same elements worked for the propaganda posters that Holbein created to tell regular citizens that they would reap the benefits of Nazi rule no matter how violent it is. Note that even for the propaganda posters on family and women's work, the strong lines and geometric elements exist. In some way, this sold the idea of strength and power for all at a time when government was repressive and brutal. Holbein would also create posters such as these ones, in contrast to the rest of his propaganda posters. Here, we still see the geometric and streamlined elements of the Art Deco aesthetic, but this time used for establishing the fact of state violence and control. Note too the symbols of the flag, the darkness that lends a sense of foreboding, and the notion of massive state power. Between Cassandra and Holbein, what we see is a sense of how a movement, given its aesthetics, can easily be used for everything, from creating art for art's sake, to creating advertising to sell products, to building propaganda for ideological and political and violent ends. Holbein is an artist whose talent has been overtaken by his links to a violent regime that killed thousands. And that is a reminder that no matter why, where, and how we create art and use our creativities, it will always remain a decision to engage or disengage, to respond or refuse, to agree or disagree with the state of the bigger society we live in at any given point in time. And that is why doing creative work is always a political act.